Good evening and welcome back to Catechesis with the Pastor. We have been talking about the vices, especially the 7 deadly sins, and tonight we are talking about acedia, or sloth, which is definitely the topic that got me interested in the whole of going through and learning more about the 7 deadly sins. Was reading about acedia and engaging in study in that. If you are joining us live online, there is, if you're coming through the parish website, there is a Rumble Talk icon down in the lower right-hand corner. You can click on that and be able to send in questions and comments during the broadcast. There is a little bit of a delay, and so if you can make sure that that slider is all the way over to the right, just so that we've minimized that delay as much as possible. That would be great. And to start tonight, I liked the reading that we had at Mass today, so we'll go with that. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. From the Gospel of Luke. On a certain Sabbath, Jesus went into the synagogue and taught, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him closely to see if he would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might discover a reason to accuse him. But he realized their intentions and said to the man with the withered hand, "Come up and stand before us." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath rather than to do evil? To save life rather than to destroy it?" Looking around at them all, he then said to him, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored. But they became enraged and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. Heavenly Father, help us to stretch out our hands, to do the good that is there to be done, to never be burdened by sorrow over the good, to always be striving in diligence and in zeal, that we may truly rejoice in the blessings you have bestowed upon us and may enjoy them forever in union with you. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. There are a couple of things that are interesting about this passage. One of them is just that St. Thomas Aquinas associates the commandment against acedia is the 3rd commandment. It's the commandment to keep holy the Sabbath day. This idea, we'll get into this more, right? But that we need to do and engage in the good things that we have received from the Lord, including this command to rest, to have this day that is dedicated just to the Lord. And so just the tie-in with the Sabbath, the tie-in, the church fathers all read this passage, and they heard that command to stretch out your hand is something that's commanded to all of us, right? Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath rather than to do evil? Is it lawful to save life rather than destroy it? If it is, then stretch out your hand and do it, right? And acedia is about this, it winds up being about this avoiding doing this good that needs to be done. And so it's a great reading to get us started for that. When we think of the term sloth, right, which is usually how acedia winds up getting translated, when we think of the term sloth, what do we think of? Really cute animals. That are slow. Laziness, right? What else? Indifference. Yeah. Sluggishness. Yeah. Lack of motivation. We just don't have that motivation. We're going to talk about what Acedia actually is focused on, and how that sense of sloth that we have that's kind of come down to us, it sort of distorts our understanding of what's going on spiritually when we're talking about Acedia. Right? So Acedia is a sorrow or a grief over our spiritual good. Right? Specifically, right over the divine good. Acedia is what you experience when it's evening and you know it's time to stop and pray. You know it's time to stop and pray, and there is this grief. There is this sorrow. There's this, I have to stop and do that again, right? And we're resistant to it, okay? Importantly, right, is the prayer like hard to do? No, right? It's not. This isn't because this is something that's exceptionally difficult. It's not toilsome or exhausting, right, in itself, right? It's not. This is not because it's something physically demanding of us, right? It's something that we know is good for us, right? In fact, we may even know that I will feel so much better after I do it. And yet there is this grief. There is this sorrow that we encounter coming to pray again. Right? And that's that acedia at work in us. Right? St. Thomas Aquinas pulls this definition of acedia out of this tremendous chaos that he finds in the tradition. Things are all over the place, talking about using different words and trying to describe different things, and he tries to gather that all together, and he actually does something rather new and ingenious, and in pulling all of these elements together and really getting at something that is this huge problem in our spiritual life. Part of the problem that he's dealing with is most of the Desert Fathers. When we talked about Evagrius, when we talked even John Damascene in this case, they're talking about temptations to sin, right? Evagrius had the 8 bad thoughts. If you're interested in all of this history, you can go back to the first talk we had in the series. And as such, Evagrius isn't necessarily looking for vices or sins, right? He's okay with passions that are just tempting towards us, right? And so he's okay talking about, and he makes a distinction between sadness and this acedia, right? But he's okay with these still being things that belong to the sensitive appetite and sort of bodily struggles that we're having. And so a lot of the tradition is okay with that. But then you get people like St. Augustine and St. Gregory the Great, who are hard to ignore, right, when you're doing theology. And they're talking about this as sin, right? Okay, well, if they're talking about it as sin, it can't just be bodily movements, right? It can't just be just emotions, right? There has to be this choice. There has to be something else that's in there. But even as he's looking at Augustine and Gregory, Augustine is using a word, it's the word we get tedium from. He's using a word for boredom, right? He's not using acedia, which we should note, even in the scriptures, right? The word is used 8 times in the Greek Old Testament. It's used 3 times in the Latin, in the Vulgate translation of the Old Testament. So it's not like it's something that's popping up frequently. The medievals didn't even know how to spell the word. Like they couldn't agree on the spelling. There are all kinds of different spellings. Even the critical editions of Aquinas' work, depending on which work you read, you'll find different spellings of Acedia. So it's a word that's not being used very much. It's a word, and yet it's really important. Gregory the Great is using tristitia. He's using sadness, right? But Aquinas interprets him as meaning this acedia, not meaning the melancholy that we find in Evagrius, right? But meaning this acedia instead. One of those Latin places where acedia gets used is in the book of Sirach, where it says, it's talking about divine wisdom. It says, put your shoulder under her and carry her, and do not fret, accedieris, under her bonds, right? Do not be wearied, do not struggle under her bonds. So if there's a command, do not do this, right, then it must be referring to something that is a choice, right? Not just a weariness of the body, right, but there is a choice here, and so we are talking about sin, right? It's also important to note that this word acedia or acediae, it's related to acidum, which is where we get the word acid. And so one of the elements that's going on in the medieval mind as they're reading this, right, is that it's also this sourness, right? The good that is supposed to be so sweet has become sour to our taste, right? Which is a lovely little thing to think about. I think it's also worth noting in Gregory, as we were sort of going down the vices, right, starting from vainglory and going down to the lesser of the 7 capital sins, right? He thought that wrath should be above the acedia, the sorrow, right? And Aquinas very intentionally switches that. Right? So he makes a choice to change. He's following Gregory very closely. He makes a choice to make that change. So he thinks there's something more serious going on here, which is also important. And that seriousness comes in because, and this is Aquinas' innovation as far as I can see, he connects it to charity. That acedia is this sin, this vice against the joy that is supposed to come from charity. Acedia is this sorrow, this grief over the things that in that very love of God we should be rejoicing in. And that's why it's something that's so serious and something that we really need to engage. Right? So before I go into any distinctions, things that it's not, any questions that come up with that? If you want more details about that, I've got a 24-page term paper that I wrote. Yeah. Goes into all of the examples in the scriptures and all of that. Is really fun. You should also go into, how does acedia manifest itself? Right? So acedia might manifest itself. We specifically speak about this divine good, but it can spill over into other, right, interior, right, spiritual goods that we have in our life, right? Acedia may be at the root of why you don't make your bed in the morning, right? I know it's actually for my good, right, to have that basic ordering in my life, and that's right, but just like, again, right? Not because it's so hard to make my bed or really, right? But again, right? So acedia can bleed into all of these other lesser things as well. It might manifest in us doing nothing, right? Right? It's time to pray. I'm just going to sit here. And maybe in 5 minutes, I'll get to it, right? Okay? But it might manifest in us doing everything else. Doing anything we can to avoid doing the thing we know we're supposed to be doing. Right? Right? So it's time to pray, but the laundry's going to come out soon, and I should check my email again. And Aunt Betty, that's probably important. Oh, look, puppies, right? And then we go down these things, and we don't get to prayer. In St. John, I think it's in John Cashin, he talks about monks suffering from acedia. Like the signs of this is like you get up every 5 minutes to go check the window to see if somebody's coming. Right? You're supposed to be a hermit living by yourself, and you're constantly getting up, go check the window to see if somebody's coming to visit. Right? You're constantly becoming convinced, like really what I should do, I should leave my cell and go to town and preach to everybody there. Like, yeah, that's what I should be doing, right? Like that avoiding of the good that belongs to the proper life, right, of the hermit, and all of trying to get out of that. And this is why in our day and age, in our society, right, the internet is so horrible, right? Because it is the worst of both worlds. Because you are doing nothing, but you feel like you are doing so much because you're clicking so many things, right? There's like this sense of productivity when it's absolutely empty and vacuous, right? Yeah, so this winds up being sort of where acedia goes so easily in our contemporary society. Right? Acedia, though, is thus also the vice of the workaholic. Right? It's the vice of the workaholic. Right? And by that, I should clarify, by workaholic, right, workaholic doesn't mean works too much. There are lots of people who work too much. Slaves work too much, right? Not because they're choosing to, right? Mothers work too much, right? Jesus and his apostles, we read, right, that there were so many people and they were so busy, like they didn't even have time to eat, right? So it's not just this like work too much. There are people who are forced to work. There are people who have work that really is so important, right? It really is so good and so important that they are going to struggle with this need and this overspending themselves and all of that, right? What we are talking about, though, is those who are throwing themselves into lesser goods to avoid much more important goods, right? Throwing themselves into the building up of the business and thus avoiding their relationship with God and their family, right? To the detriment of these more important goods, right? That screams the vice of acedia, right? Instead of being drawn to those more important things, those greater goods, we just throw ourselves into these lesser goods.
So it's really interesting thing, because I always sort of thought sloth was like the efficiency of activity around it. So it's either side. It's efficiency.
Yes.
And excessive activity and avoidance of what is spiritually correct.
So yes, so it is deficiency and excess of activity, right, in avoidance of what is actually spiritually correct. There is a reference in the book of Sirach that suggests that acedia, avoiding acedia, is what actually leads to true rest. Right? We'll talk a little bit about that, but right, that like true rest is actually something very different than what acedia is. And all the more, right, this connection then to that third commandment to keep holy the Sabbath, right? To keep holy that time of rest. Engaging in our proper good, our divine good, actually leads to rest, rather than the avoidance of it that seems like doing nothing. We would think that would be called rest, right?
So, it's a lot easier to pray the office online if you're doing it alone than to set your breviary and do it right. But online is better than nothing if you are so lacking in focus and so old and decrepit and mentally incompetent that you just can't get it done.
Yes. So when I said the internet is so horrible, I did not mean in an absolute sense. I meant insofar as we are struggling with this vice, right? And so yes, we can find wonderful uses of the internet, like iBreviary and providing the liturgy of the hours for us without needing to know how ribbons work and all of that kind of stuff. Those are very wonderful uses that we can have of the internet. But when it comes to this struggle of acedia, the way that we can be engaged in things that are so vacuous and yet feel productive really makes it a terrible sinkhole for this sin. Right? Some of the things that acedia is not. And you do a simple search for acedia or sloth, right? And all of these things, like, they're going to come up. Like, oh, this is what it means. It's like, no, we're dealing with something very different. Okay? Acedia is not depression, right? Acedia is this spiritual condition, right? And acedia is focused on the divine good or some other spiritual or interior good, right? When somebody is suffering from depression, they don't want to do anything, right? It's not just that they're struggling to pray, they're struggling to get out of bed. They're struggling to do anything, right? That's a very different condition, right? And something that needs very different solutions and very different tools, right, to be working on. And so if we're having an experience where we're struggling to do everything, right, we may still be suffering from acedia, but it's going to be hard to tell because, right, we've got this depression that's covering over everything, right? Sloth or laziness, I think we've covered that already. Just the fact that acedia can be very, very active. It can be very, very active, right? And I think that blinds us to how acedia actually manifests itself in our culture, right? Perhaps so much more than it ever has in history. It's not the avoidance of toil, right? So there may be acedia involved when I don't want to do the thing that is hard, that is going to take a lot of physical work, right? Or a lot of time or something like that, right? I may have acedia that's in there, but just the fact that I don't want to do hard work is something else, right? That's bodily. That has to do with the emotions and the passions, right? That itself is not acedia. There still may be some element of, I know this is for my good, I know this is the divine good, and I just don't want to have anything to really do with that, I'm sick of that kind of thing. but just the toil itself. Other things can come in that are similar. Fear, right? I don't want to do it because I'm afraid. Right? And that, again, that's something different than the acedia that's going on. All of these can get mixed together, which is part of what makes it all so difficult, right? But it is something distinct and different. Just doing a simple search, I came up with things that by acedia, the medievals meant despair. Despair is one of the effects of acedia. It's one of the daughters of acedia. We'll talk about that in a little bit, right? But it's despair is that loss of hope, right? Despair is that loss of hope. It's that belief that no good can ever come, right? And that's different than that recognition of my good. That it just fills me with this sense of sorrow or grief. Okay? And then one of the things where Aquinas is kind of critical of the tradition, the monastics often called acedia the noonday devil or the noonday demon, right? And Aquinas says that was just because of the schedule they kept. Right? It hit them at that time because of the schedule they kept. It has nothing to do with the time of day. Right? That was just the schedule they kept. So he doesn't like bringing that phrase into our discussions of acedia. Right? Any questions on this?
So at the beginning you said acedia were sloth, but then sloth is not acedia.
Yeah. So I said acedia or sloth because that's usually what this word gets translated as, is sloth. And when you look at the list of the 7 deadly sins, none of them are going to have acedia. It's going to be sloth. That's the English word that's been chosen for this. Even acedia is not properly a Latin word. It's a Greek word that they kind of smuggled in. And it's a rare Latin word, and so there's been a long history of not knowing what word to give this experience. Right? Not knowing what word to give this vice. And English stumbled over it by calling it sloth. And the vast majority of what you read, if you go online, it'll say that the vice of sloth is laziness. Like, maybe, right? Or maybe something very different. When I pick up a book that's on the 7 deadly sins, the first thing I do is I flip to acedia, right? Like, how do they describe acedia? If the first thing they say is this is laziness, like, this person hasn't done their research. This is just going off of sort of how I read this list of words and I think about how it makes me feel, and then I reflect on my life. And this is what I think it is, right? Instead of actually engaging in the history and the critical reflection on sin and vice in our lives.
You made a point that some work is really important. And I don't know if you're talking about literally putting out fires, resuscitating babies, or just studying for an exam that you put off studying for.
Yeah, so in saying that some work is really important, principally what I was pointing to, the care of children and the home, right, is something that takes a tremendous amount of time and effort, right? And especially when we are dealing with the really little ones, right, and all of their needs and all of that, And one of the problems, right, then is that I have those young mothers in my confessional, right? And they are so upset because they can't find that time to pray, right? And we can talk about how we want to work on trying to find how prayer is going to be functioning in this mode of life, right? And how we're going to incorporate prayer into everything, right? And doing this, we can talk about that, right? Yeah, I would not want to be in the vicinity if you decided to call one of those mothers a workaholic because they weren't praying enough, right? Like that's not what's going on, right? It's not that they are avoiding what is most important for something lesser. They have this duty that is so important and so essential, and trying to balance it with all of the other things is so great. So that's what I meant by we have those who are doing those sort of most important works, right? That there are going to be struggles there and that balancing. Jesus and his apostles, right? And all of the people who were coming to them. There's that recognition, right, that they should, right? They've been going so long doing this, they should stop. They should go away and find a place, right, to rest and relax. And that utterly fails, right, because the crowds find them anyways, right? And they're completely overwhelmed by the people again. We're not going to accuse Jesus and the apostles of being workaholics, right? There's something else that's going on. It's because that work really is something that is so essential. And the need is so great, right? That finding a real balance in life is going to be hard, right? But it's not because we're neglecting the more important for something that's less. Right. Yeah.
Just thinking about the definition, when I hear the word sorrow and grief, I think primarily of a sorrow or grief that one experiences that happens to one as opposed to maybe one that one indulges in. And so I'm curious if, I guess I'm just struggling a little bit to understand when exactly the will becomes culpable for Acedia. Like when, is there a moment in Acedia maybe where one experiences sorrow and then chooses it, or where exactly?
Yeah, where does the will come into this? That's a great question. And so first there is this recognition that we can talk about this sorrow just as that passion, right? But we are talking about this sin, right? When we start choosing to avoid that good, right? We start making those choices to avoid that good. And there is the as we start talking about the daughters of Acedia, there is that sort of projecting onto like this is something that is sorrowful, right? That starts to happen, and this choosing to view it that way, not just sort of the experience that happens, the passions that may be there, right? But the choosing.
So you could conceivably be experiencing grief over a good while not committing the sin of Acedia.
Right. Yeah. We can experience some of these passions without making the bad choice, right? One of the things that's important, that word sorrow, right? Sorrow is the passion that we experience when we perceive that we are lacking in some good, right? We perceive that we're lacking in some good, and we feel this sorrow, right? We're going to talk about the irony of that when it gets to despair, which is kind of cool. So a quote from Aquinas. This is from his. Gregory the Great had that huge 3-volume moral interpretation of Job. So Aquinas does a literal interpretation of Job, because who's going to rewrite Gregory, right? I mean, you can't really compete. So he tries to go through and do a literal interpretation of it. So, but this is a quote from him talking about some of these things. Now, it usually happens that divine worship is performed devoutly by some people if it should be rare. But when it is frequent, it comes into distaste. Sourness, right? Yeah. And this is the sin of acedia, namely when someone is saddened over a spiritual task. Right? And so acedia is rightly called the vice of monks. Acedia is something that everyone who takes their spiritual life seriously is going to have to face. Right? If divine worship is something that you just do once in a while, right? Then maybe each time it's exciting enough, it's awesome enough, and you really give yourself fully to it. But when you're doing it day in and day out, right? That's going to bring about this acedia. Right? And so it is the vice of monks. It is a terrible scourge on the priesthood. Right? It is a huge struggle for anyone who is going to devote themselves to the divine life in this world. So you're in good company, right? This is something that all of the saints had to go through. All of them had to struggle with. Right? Okay, so why do we struggle with it? Because there is this passion, right? This sorrow and grief that arises from frequent experiences of the good, right? And this is a fault. This is a fault we generally we grow into as adults, right? If you pick a child up and you swing them around, right, and then you put them down, right, and what do? They say, again, right? And you pick them up and you swing them around, and then you put them down, and they say, again, right? And you pick them up and you swing them around, and who's going to get tired of this first? Right? Right? We as adults, we somehow grow into this thing where, like, repetition just gets tiresome for us. And we don't, things that we initially found great joy in, repetition and monotony, it's just like, it feels like such a drag, right? Whereas children can watch the same movie over and over and over and over and over and over again and never get tired of it, right? But there's this sorrow, this grief that often arises, right? That's there. It's mixed with all of these other sorrows as well, from the body and mind that dissuade us from doing the things that we should do, right? So in addition to this sorrow over the good that I know is present, what we're talking about may also be toilsome, right? It may take a long time, right? And so there are other, I may be just physically completely wiped out, right? I am exhausted. I can barely keep my eyes open, right? And so there are all of these other things that can come into play that also dissuade us from doing the good, right? And therefore can encourage the acedia, right? Even when it's something that's totally innocent, like I'm just flat out exhausted because of what's been going on, right? But it can give fuel to the acedia. I think another thing is just our divine good is often not as tangible as the lesser goods, right? And I can know that stopping to pray is going to be good for me, and it's going to make me feel better even, right? But I can't measure that, right? Like it's not some kind of like formula or something that's been applied. Whereas so many lesser goods, like I can measure that, right? it's really easy to recognize the connection between the brownie and feeling happy, right? Like these things are much more natural and easier to grasp. One of the things we might add to this, there's as we're going further and further into these vices, there are these elements of spiritual warfare that are also increasing as well, right? Acedia is going to stop me from praying. Acedia is going to stop me from seeking my divine good, right? The devil loves this vice, right? And I think this is part of why Aquinas is willing to elevate it even against St. Gregory the Great, right? Why it really is so important, right, that we are talking about this vice and dealing with it. It prevents us from rejoicing in our ultimate good, right? This is taking away our joy in union with God, our joy in prayer. It's getting in the way of our ultimate good. It takes us away from doing the good that we need to do. Okay? So the Desert Fathers will talk about how if you conquer acedia, nothing will stand in your way. If you conquer acedia, nothing will stand in your way, right? No vice can stand against somebody who's beaten acedia, right? If you never tire of doing the good, how quickly can we progress in the virtues? Right? Acedia is always going to be there to hold us back. Oh, I'm tired of doing this again. Right? If we could actually root that out, right? It leads to very dangerous paths, especially that of despair. Right? And we'll talk more about that when we get to the daughters. And it's important to talk about because it's something that must be faced by everyone who's going to take their spiritual life seriously. One of the places that St. Augustine is talking about this boredom, this acedia, his commentary on Psalm 107. Psalm 107 goes through these like 4 stages. He interprets it as going through these 4 stages sort of the spiritual life, right? And how God answers our needs in each of those 4 stages, right? But what's described, it's allegorical, right? What's described are these 4 ways of like suffering and being in need of the Lord and crying out to him, right? So the first one is some had lost their way in a barren desert, found no path to a city they could live in. They were hungry and thirsty. Their life was ebbing away. And they cried to the Lord in their distress, who rescued them in their peril. And Augustine interprets this as those who don't know God, right? They're lost. They don't know him, right? The second one, some lived in darkness and gloom, in prison, bound with chains, because they rebelled against God's word, scorned the counsel of the Most High, who humbled their hearts through hardship. They stumbled with no one to help. In their distress, they cried to the Lord, right? And this he interprets as those who are steeped in their sins, right? Bound in the chains of their sins. Then there's the third one. Some fell sick from their wicked ways, afflicted because of their sins. They loathed all manner of food. They were at the gates of death. In their distress, they cried to the Lord, right? And Augustine interprets this as acedia, right? Loathed all manner of food. They don't like that which is good for them. They don't like that which they need, right? For their good, their survival, right? That this is what happens to us in the spiritual life, that we come to then have this distaste for the spiritual goods, right? It's that struggle then with acedia. And then the fourth one's longer. Some went off to the sea in ships, plied their trade on the deep waters. They saw the works of the Lord, the wonders of God in the deep. He spoke and he roused the storm wind and tossed the waves high, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is pride, right? Those who have this pride that they are going to go out and do these great things upon the sea. And it's that fourth, right, that final thing that needs to be rooted out. But anyways, right, it also, like, so for Augustine, right, we also get the sense of how this is something that's really kind of necessary in the spiritual life and what we're going to be dealing with. Right. Any questions on this? Yeah.
Say you're supposed to go to mass and just decide to say your rosary. So instead of feeling an obligation completely, just do part of it. Would that also be like
So if we skip mass but pray a rosary instead, would that be acedia? A lot of this is going to be there are a lot of complexities that can come into any of these questions, right? We need to remember that moral analysis is always done from the first person perspective. Right? We can never do a full analysis from a third person perspective. Right? It's always done from that first person perspective. And so, right, so I need to know, right, why you chose one over the other. Right? If it was because there was something particularly toilsome about getting to Mass, right, it may not really be acedia, right? Or fear, right? About going to Mass, right? We may not be talking about acedia at all, right? If none of that is present, right? None of that kind of stuff is present. It may be that I've developed such a distaste for Mass and for the good, and maybe I've just convinced myself, well, I'll just do this, which I may not find tasteful either, but at least then I'll feel better about myself for not going to Mass, or something like that, right? There are all kinds of elements that can be in the mix in this, and it's for the individual, as it were, right, to go through and analyze and think about, why did I do that, right? What was going on in my mind? What were the passions that were involved? Why was I avoiding something, right? And being able to reflect on those levels. All right, what do we see? He's sleeping. He's got his pillow in his chair. I think it's a little dog who's also sleeping. Yes, sister has rosary beads. Here, it's time to pray. Yeah.
See the candle burning out?
Yeah, the candle. Yeah. Anything else? No, it's not. It's not. He came prepared. That's true. Yes, that pillow is a great sign. He came prepared. There's a closed book here, right? He's not studying. There's a crucifix up here. Just sort of like put away up there. Doesn't really matter. Yeah. Any guesses on the associated color? It's usually gray is a good guess. Brown. How about the animal? The medievals didn't know about sloths. What's that? Cat? I was going through, there's a basilica in Lyon that has mosaics of the 7 deadly sins. There's a cat for wrath. Which it's kind of awesome. That's a good one. So the color is actually light blue. And I've seen 2 explanations. The most common explanation is light blue is sort of associated with daydreaming. But the other one is that light blue is associated with like ice, with like this frozen, with this sort of not moving kind of thing. Associated animals, there are actually 2 you see a lot in images. One is a snail, and the other is a donkey, pretty close to a mule. So, yeah. All right, what are its daughters? So this is the list that Gregory the Great gives, right? Malice, spite, faint-heartedness, despair, sluggishness in following the precepts, wandering of mind after unlawful things. So Aquinas goes through and he explains these, right? When we have great sorrow and grief over something, right? We try to separate ourselves from it, right? We try to get away from it. We try to avoid it, right? And so one of the first things, right? We might want to avoid the end itself, right? If the divine good is making us sad, right, then we do what we can to avoid it, right? But this starts to really lead to that despair, right? Our sorrow can become so oppressive that it seems no good could be possible, right? And what's kind of ironic about this, right, is I feel this sorrow because the divine good is present. And through that sorrow, I come to this conclusion that no good is possible. The ultimate good is already right there staring me in the face. But I've become convinced that the good isn't really possible in my life. Right? Joseph Pieper says, though not the only offspring of Acedia, despair is the most legitimate. Right? That there is this real danger of if we just keep letting Acedia go, then we really can come to this despair that I'll ever be able to have the good again in my life. Right? And it certainly is something I encounter in the confessional. People who are struggling with Acedia, and they're starting to doubt that they can ever have that wonderful spiritual life they had before. Right? And you start to see that despair at work. If we're not rejecting the end itself, then we might be rejecting the means, right? The things that help us to get to it, right? And trying to get away from them. So he says the faint-heartedness is that is against the counsels of the Lord. So remember that the counsels of the Lord, things like the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, right? These are things that are not required of everyone to do, right? But there is something heroic and great and wonderful about them, right? Faint-heartedness is that not engaging in these things that have been recommended to us that are great and beautiful and wonderful, right? But not having that losing that desire to step up for that. Closely then related, right, is sluggishness in the precepts. These are the things you do have to do, right? These are the things that we are really supposed to be doing. Everyone is supposed to be doing, but we're slow to be engaging in that and doing that. Then we also notice that there are people who are encouraging others to do these good things and to prayer and to union with God and all of that. And those people are so aggravating. And this spite comes out, right? This hatred or indignation towards people who are leading others, right, to the good. Malice, I do think St. Thomas Aquinas may be taking some liberties with Gregorian malice here, but hatred towards the divine goods themselves, right? And so this hatred that is coming out of this acedia. We start to hate the good things and the things that lead to them. And then a very common thing, right, this wandering of mind after unlawful things. Probably in confession and talking with people, the two most common sort of areas that we see the sins of lust coming from and manifesting themselves, right? What's the first one? Well, so aside from lust itself, right, of the vices. Right? Not from gluttony. Gluttony closely attached to lust, right? It's wrath. It's that anger, right? That so often is at the source of people's struggles with lust, right? And so when people are coming to me and they're telling me that their sin is resulting because of stress, because of frustrations, because of, right? So when I had a really hard week, right, with these things in the job and all of that, that's when these struggles come up, right? It's that anger, that wrath, right, that winds up leading to it. But the second most common thing is, like, it happens when I'm bored. I have nothing to do. And that leads to this wandering of mind after unlawful things, right? This failure to engage in the good things that there are there to do, right? My own interior and spiritual goods, right? And that leads to, and then the mind goes down these paths. Right? Any questions on the daughters?
Is faint-heartedness similar to being lukewarm?
I think we could probably say faint-heartedness is similar to that sense of being lukewarm. Yeah. Yeah. There's something similar there. Yeah.
The parable that Jesus tells about the talents, is that Acedia? The one where the servant bears his talent?
The parable about the talents, right? The 10 talents and the depending on which gospel you're looking at. There's probably something of acedia in that, right? Of the servant that just buries it, right? And doesn't want to engage in the work that he should be doing. And it points out the claim there is sort of like fear, right? That you were a demanding master, right? And the response is, if you knew I was demanding, why didn't you do something? That would have made more sense. But yeah, there may be something of that acedia in there as well.
I see that parable as excessive avoidance of taking any risk. But I don't, in other words, there's a fine line between taking a risk with something and just burying it.
Yeah, and I think we could interpret the parable from a perspective of fear, right? And that risk taking and that need for that, which would be a very different analysis from the analysis of there's a good that needs to be done, and I know it really is for my good, and I just choose not to do it. Yeah. Okay, so virtues opposed to acedia. So again, there's something that seems rather innovative of St. Thomas Aquinas, that he associates acedia under his discussion of charity, right? That it is this sin against charity. And particularly against the joy that is supposed to come from charity, right? So instead of this joy that should be there in that love we have received from God, in that friendship we have from God, right? Instead, we're experiencing this, we're having this sorrow in that place, right? And we're acting in these ways, right? We're making these choices as if this is something sorrowful instead of something that fills us with joy. Right? Right, growth in charity, how do we grow in charity? Just do it, right? Right, so this is engagement in that union with God, right? All of the things that are that engagement with union in God, and all of those things that are in engagement with God's image in the people around us, right? In the serving of our neighbor just out of love for him, right? All of those things, right, are going to be a part of how we're going to deal with acedia. One of the really important virtues or things that we talk about in the context of acedia is zeal, right? And this is the thing about zeal, right? How many of us have had that sort of conversion experience in our life? Right? Okay? And there is with that experience, right, there's all of this zeal. Right? We are on fire. Right? And the thing is, we didn't do anything to earn that. That zeal is a gift. And it's awesome. Right? We are going to have to do something if we want to keep it. We are going to have to do something if we want to keep it. And so we need to find these things that are going to help us to practice that zeal, right? Help us to really build up and maintain that zeal, right? That recognition of just how awesome and how good, right? The life Christ has made for us, that he has given us, the gifts that he has presented us in this world, right? The vocation, the calling that has been, like we need to constantly be reflecting on how amazing it is that we get to encounter him in the Eucharist and in the Mass, right? That we can spend time with him in the Scriptures and in prayer, right? And we need to constantly be feeding this to help us maintain that zeal, right? You get it for nothing, but if you want to keep it, it's going to take work, right? And that's a very common conversation I have with someone several months after this big conversion experience that they had. Whether they were Catholic all their lives, but something really awesome has happened and changed the way they think about their faith now, right? Or have come into the faith maybe even from nothing, right? But several months later, right, then there's this conversation about how they're struggling. And maybe it's a few years later that there's another conversation about how they're struggling. And then there's a change in life. And the prayer life they used to have, it's just not possible anymore. Like, it just doesn't fit, right? And, what happened? And everything's becoming burdensome now. And there is this Acedia that's building, right? And there's often that talk about how we need to, you had that zeal for nothing. Now you got to do something, right? We're going to find ways to build that back up. Fortitude is important, right? Just in terms of we are dealing with we are dealing with some difficult things, and we need that fortitude to get ourselves to do it. But ultimately, right, diligence is the virtue that we point to, right? Or solicitude, right? This like when you realize the good that needs to be done, do it now. Not after I go check on this, or in 5 minutes I'll get to it, right? Do it now, right? And cultivating that diligence. So some of the tools we have against acedia. The first recommendation that comes from the fathers, right? You need to charge into battle. And they actually talk about this in contradiction to lust, right? Do you remember what we said about lust? Run away, flee, get out of there. Right? Just go do something else and get your mind off of it. Okay? Acedia is exactly the opposite. When there's that acedia present, you charge into battle. Right? And that's that diligence. We are getting in there, right? And we're just going to do it. Okay? And that diligence then is something that we practice, right? And we practice in all the little things, right? And it can be why having a sort of scheduled and regular life can be very helpful, right, for this practice. I do this at this time every day, right? And just keeping and working and maintaining that, right? It can be a very helpful part of that practice. There are going to be times in our life when that's not possible, right? With just the elements of chaos, who happen to be like 5, 3, and 1 years old, right? Like there's just no way like you can do, right? But when there is the room for that, right? Then we use that to help us grow in that diligence. Having that structure in our lives can then help us for that diligence, so that when that structure is taken away from us, right, we can respond to the goods that we need to be doing, and doing that well. Right. Cultivating that zeal. Right. And there are a number of things we can do to help us cultivate that. One is to go back to things that helped get it started in the beginning, right? Maybe it was a book you read, and you know what? It's been a few years. I'm going to go back and read that again because that was awesome, right? And it refreshes, right? And it reminds us. I've said this before, and we had a whole catechesis with the pastor on it. I read G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy every year because it radically refreshes just my whole worldview. Right? Find something like that can help. Yeah. G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. Yeah. So going back to something that is done that for you before, right? That has really helped with that zeal before. The opposite direction of finding something new, right? And this is the thing about the Catholic Church. Like, you are never going to exhaust the resources. Never. You're never going to get close, right? Finding something new, right? Not because you need to add more and more and more and more stuff, right? But just another perspective, another lens on just how beautiful and awesome and fantastic what we have received is, right? The next two, I think, are connected to that, and I think they have a lot to do with the zeal as well. One is deepening yourself in community, right? The community supports each other in the midst of this. And when one of us is discouraged, the rest can help, right, and encourage, right? And when I'm tempted to skip mass, right? Oh, but people notice, and okay, well, it probably is better anyways, and like that. But hopefully, even more than that, like I could call a friend and be like, I don't want to go to mass today, right? And have someone who will respond and support me and help me to get to where I need to go, right? And I think we see so much. We see so much of what is awesome in the faith, what is so good in the divine through others, right? Through their own actions and their own life and how they're living it, right? But also through their experiences. So I have, in my priesthood, I've always been involved in RCIA, which is not always that common. But I've always been involved in RCIA because that's one of the best cures I've found for acedia. Because seeing the faith come to life in those people year in and year out, right? Seeing it come to life in them, it renews me, right? And it forces me to, this is a huge part of teaching too, right? It forces me to remind myself of just how awesome this life is, right? Even if as I walk in and out of that church, right, a dozen times a day, right? And it's just a mundane, plain place, right? There's nothing special. I just go in and out and in and out and in and having to remind myself again and again and again, right? And when that's not enough, the Lord sticks things into the lectionary or something, and then like I have to preach against myself, and then like it's right, and then and that sometimes a little begrudgingly, like all right, fine, yeah, or sends me people who want to talk about vocation, who want to talk about these kinds of things. And I have to go back through my vocation, and I have to go back through these things. And the Lord works very hard keep these things going for me so that I don't sink into that vice, right? That seeing anew through another's eyes, I think one of the elements of that, and Chesterton says something about this, like sometimes if you can't see how awesome things are from within, sometimes the best point of view is from a really far distance away, right? And really seeing it from the outside. And so that part of seeing things anew through another's eyes is part of that. Yeah.
One question.
Yeah.
It's like you have in there like charge in the battle, zeal, like interesting words, terminology, like zeal. I think I know what you mean. Zeal. But at what point does it go to the excessive activity and it's a maniacal zeal and it's like
Right.
avoiding something and it's manic, you know?
Yeah. All in good measure. Yes. So obviously one could go overboard with zeal or something of that sort, right? We could certainly have things get out of bounds. We can have. I think one of the real dangers is that I stir all this stuff up emotionally, but there's no content. There's no real solid ground, right? And I think we see a lot of this of people who keep pushing themselves emotionally to say this is so great, this is so awesome, but they're not grounding themselves in the reality, right? In the study, actually, some of these things get into that, right? Because the freedom from acedia really is rest. The freedom from acedia is real, authentic rest. Right? And again, it's associated with the Sabbath. So get rid of or limit some of those lesser goods. Right? And so today, that might mean things like social media and the news feeds and all of that kind of stuff. Right? To get rid of them or at least limit them, right? Make sure if you find yourself to be one who throws themselves into lesser forms of work, right? Make sure that you're putting limits on that, right? That are reasonable, right? But so that you're able to recognize I'm giving too much to this, and that means I'm not giving things to where I should be. Right? To really think about and put some limits or just get rid of some of those things, right, that distract us. To cultivate true rest and to learn truly how to rest. This is one of the other problems that we have, especially with our media. Television and movies, they're not actually restful. They actually put our brain into a state that is not really a resting state. And so we need to cultivate, we need to recognize what are the things that are actually going to be restful. Or, right, like, so we waste an hour just like scrolling through stuff, right? I'd have been so much better off just taking a nap, right? Like, or spending an hour, like, doing something I enjoyed, right? And so being very intentional about how we rest. How we rest, our body, our mind, right, and our emotions, and spiritually, right? How do I spend that time resting and being very intentional about it? Because part of the problem is, and we've talked about this before, part of the problem is that if we don't give ourselves that rest, then the body and the mind are just going to take over and and extracted out of us anyways. Right? And part of this, like getting stuck just scrolling for an hour, right? Like that's the body and the mind. Like it's trying to rest. It's trying to, and you haven't let it. So now it's just trying to shut everything down, not focus on anything else, right? Because it's trying to get that. And so we need to make sure we're finding healthy paths to that rest. Yeah.
What do you mean by rest? Is it necessarily inactivity or?
It can be some of the most basic things like making sure you're getting enough sleep, right? It can, but a lot of times it's going to be the kind of activities that that wind up bearing fruit in these various ways, right? I need to spend time with friends. And there's something that is restful and relaxing about spending time with good people that I care about and that care about me, right? And if I don't do that, there's a certain rest in me that is lacking, right? Some of this is just having hobbies that you enjoy doing, right? Where there isn't a work that is demanded of you, right? But there's something that you find fun and maybe creative, and there's just like there are these elements, right, to it that are part of that rest. It's letting the brain and perhaps the body get into these modes of just doing things that are just fun, just good, right? And that can be, things like reading and art and all of those kinds of things. It's a little embarrassing, but one of the ways I rest, my degree was in computer engineering. I miss having my brain work that way. So I will code as part of my rest, right? I that kind of logic in my brain enjoys working that way, and it doesn't get to do that very much. So it's something I find restful, right? The practicing of silence, right? And that ability in our prayer. Even just in our lives in general, to be able to have times of silence, right? And that's not just exterior silence. That's interior silence as well. It's being able to not have that incessant monologue running all the time, right? And being able just to sit and be quiet and ideally in the presence of the Lord, right? And recognizing his presence there with us, right? One of the problems, one of the things that leads to that wandering of mind after unlawful things is we're very uncomfortable with that. We're very uncomfortable with time that really is just set aside to do nothing, to have that silence and that peace, right? We've talked about with that can come feelings of loneliness and all of this kind of stuff, right? And this feeling very uncomfortable with that. Learning to be able to have that silence, that peace, to perhaps feel lonely, and to know all that's okay, and actually may be really good for us. And then something just let others help you find balance. To have those people in your life who are going to constantly bug you until you've scheduled your retreat for the year. those people who are going to be checking and making sure, right, that you're getting the rest that you need, who are going to be, encouraging you, right, in the different aspects of your life to find that balance, who know you and care about you, and are going to be a part of that. And perhaps the most important tool of all, right? What is Acedia taking us away from? Prayer, right? That union with God, right? Moreover, right? Like this is one of the most difficult of the vices to engage in, and so all the more reason it needs prayer, right? Even as prayer is what it's trying to stop us from doing. And so as we're struggling with acedia, right, we need to up the prayer. More and more and more and more, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean like more time, right? But it does mean this emphasis on like bringing prayer into the whole of our life, right? Bringing these struggles with acedia to prayer, right? Constantly asking the Lord for that strength and that help so that we can persevere, right, through this difficulty and this challenge. So, any questions on those tools?
Would you say that maybe beauty and maybe sacred art is a good tool against acedia?
I think beauty and sacred art are a tremendous tool against acedia, right? And I think part of it really helps to cultivate that zeal, right? It helps us to just recognize how awesome this is, right? Beauty reveals that to us in really important ways. All of the transcendentals, right, are going to be there, right? And so some of us are really drawn to truth, right? And it's reading theology, spending time with Aquinas through these weeks on the virtues and vices. It's just been like, oh, this is so refreshing and so great, right? Right, and then there's goodness. And I think one of the things that really can be helpful is the moral beauty of the saints, right? Reading the lives of the saints and reading about the saints and that goodness, right, is something that can be very helpful to encourage us and help us to recognize what we're doing.
I guess just as a comment, maybe that's why beautiful churches are so important, to maybe help the church against acedia in a way. Maybe even an expensive piece of art if it helps people relate beauty to spiritual good.
Yeah. No, that the importance of beauty in our churches, in our liturgy, right? The importance of again, right? Like what brings about, what causes this acedia? Mr. Pat was asking, how do I avoid acedia? And I said, well, you could just not engage in the spiritual life. That probably right. But one of the cause of acedia, right, is not that I occasionally engage in the spiritual life. It's that I do it again and again and again and again, right? But if we're not doing anything in our space and in our liturgy and whatnot to really emphasize this is not part of the mundane. This is not part of the everyday. This is something special, right? How much easier is it to fall into, like, this is just something that we just do, and it's just every day, and again, I really would rather not, right? that beauty and that so much of what we do to make it special, right, helps us against that acedia. Any other questions? You got through that faster than I expected. I was afraid I was going to keep you here for 3 or 4 hours. Wonderful. So next week, we're going to get into envy, which should be interesting if we remember envy is something that kind of like gets slipped in by St. Gregory the Great and then becomes part of this discussion. So we'll look at sort of why that is and particularly why Aquinas thinks that is and how that gets into the work there. So, let's close with prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, grant us the gifts of diligence and zeal, that we might root out that acedia, that we might persevere in the joy of the divine good you have bestowed upon us, that we might always seek to grow in a greater union with you and never tire of it, that we might have a foretaste of that eternal life where we will always be going further up and further in, always encountering the unfathomable depth of your being, your truth, your goodness, your beauty. And we ask this through Christ, our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. We'll see you next week.